Attention all drafters. This is a public service announcement brought to you by Lucky Paper Radio's Department of Salt Prevention. At this time, it is the recommendation of the LPR DOSP that you do not, under any circumstances, hate draft. Hate drafting has serious side effects, including drafting a worse deck because you threw away a pick, never playing against the player you're hate drafting from, and being tempted by a greedy, ill-advised splash. Stop. We must all do our part. When everyone's deck is better, your deck is better.
I made some tasty pizza tonight, Anthony, for an early dinner.
Oh my God, are we going to talk about food?
You know how we do. You know how,
what kind of
how
pizza?
we do.
What kind of pizza did you make?
Well, we didn't have any tomato sauce or any proper cheese for
or
pizza.
bread.
Well, no, I made the dough.
Okay.
What we did have is some semi-dried tomatoes in oil, which I just kind of chopped up a little bit. Made a little pesto with some basil from the garden, and I threw some Gouda on top, because Gouda was the closest thing we had to a pizza-appropriate cheese, and it came out pretty okay. That was pretty tasty.
I want you to know I see the Gouda joke, and I am choosing not to take it.
What's
Just
the
going to
joke?
leave there.
What's the joke?
Anyway, so I made some pasta with eggplant and tomato sauce. It was pretty good.
You make a good pasta with eggplant.
Yeah.
Oh boy, what should we talk about first, Anthony?
I think we should crack a pack.
Go right to the Cracker Pack? Let's do that.
Yeah,
So, this week we are doing a Cracker Pack submitted by a listener. As you know, dear listeners, we do a Pack One Pick One from a cube every week on the show. This week the cube is submitted by listener Chris Martin. Thank you, listener Chris, who has submitted his dichotomy cube, with which, Anthony, it's a very interesting cube. It's 361 cards, and half of them are white, and half of them are black, and then it includes Jace the Mind Sculptor. and I don't know if this is a mistake or...
I know what color I want to draft.
So, I mean, it's a really interesting way to make Jace much less powerful. If it's the only blue card in the entire draft, you could splash it in your white or white-black deck, but I don't think there's any fixing for white or blue as far as I remember. In fact, there's no fixing lands in this at all, it seems. There's just some color-associated lands. I don't see any dual lands anywhere in here. So it's a very interesting cube, to say the least. What do you think of the black-white distinction? Is there anything you're looking for going into this pack before we start talking about the cards?
I think it's interesting that actually between black and white, you do cover most of the different kinds of effects you have. So in terms of actual gameplay, I feel like it's ultimately going to feel like regular Magic. You can interact with all the different kinds of permanents. You have good removal, efficient creatures. I think it would have a much bigger effect on the draft itself, which is definitely something that we saw as well, trying to draft a mono black cube. This is, I think, going to be similar, where it's going to be harder to read signals and figure out what lane you should be in. So I don't know if that actually influences like a pack one, pick one all that much.
All right. Well, you're reading the pack this week, Anthony, so let's dive into our pack.
Okay. This looks pretty cool. What do you think? Should I just do white cards and black cards, or go in order?
Chef's choice. I leave it up to you.
All right. Let's do white and then black. Spoiler, we did not open Jace the Mind Sculptor.
Damn it.
It's very disappointing.
I mean, we'll talk about it after this, whether you would take Jace over whatever we decide to take from this pack. But go ahead. Let's get started.
All right, so card number one. I think that a lot of these are going to be cards that are unfamiliar to us, so I will be doing a fair amount of reading. We've got a White Shield Crusader. It is white for a 2/1 pro-black. It's got two activated abilities. White... Sorry. It's going to be difficult.
Pay a white.
Pay a
for
white.
Shield Crusader.
And this creature gains flying until end of turn. And pay 2 white, this creature gets +1 power until end of turn. So it's sort of like White Knight, but with flying. Sorry, no. I completely read that wrong. It's just
You
like a
can
Black
give it
Knight.
flying.
It looks like it flies, and you can give it flying. Okay.
Right off the bat, I feel like a card with protection from half the cube is probably not a horrible place to start. But
seems pretty strong to me.
I don't know. I'm probably not going to start there, but let's see where we go from here.
All right, Angel of Deliverance. This is a 6 white, so an 8 mana card. It's a 6/6 flying Delirium. Whenever an Angel of Deliverance deals combat damage to a player, if you have Delirium, which is 4 different card types in your graveyard, exile target creature an opponent controls.
Definitely a big payoff if you manage to turn Delirium on. I feel like that's going to be extra difficult in a black-white only cube. I feel like a lot of the sort of self-mill stuff ends up being in like green and blue, so you're kind of relying on things ending up in your graveyard somewhat through the course of normal play. And also, I don't know how many artifacts or enchantments or planeswalkers we can expect in this environment. I'm looking now, there are no planeswalkers. And also no fetch lands. So I feel like I'm off this card at 6 mana, and it seems like Delirium's going to be hard to turn on.
Oh, bad news. It's 8 mana.
Oh, it's 8 mana. I am 100% off this card, and can't imagine playing it, frankly. Maybe it's in here for some kind of reanimator strategy is all I can think.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think for all those reasons, and there's just not going to be a lot of ramp in either of these colors, so I think an 8 mana spell in general is going to be have to be pretty good to get me excited about it.
And if there is some kind of reanimator supported, I'm not sure there is, but I would hope to do a little better than just a 6/6 with flying and occasional upside.
Yeah, reanimator's already like enough of a thing that you need to set up, and also needing to jump through the hoop of setting up Delirium to make this really worth a card is a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot like the ramp decks we've been talking about. You know, all of the mana dorks are, in a way, kind of card disadvantage. And certainly, you know, running a bunch of setup cards, discard outlets, and reanimation spells just to get a big creature in play. I really want that big creature to be worth it. So, yeah, I'm off Angel of Deliverance.
All right, next card, though, I think maybe you'll be familiar with, is Mobilization. This is a 3 mana enchantment.
Mobilization?
Soldiers have vigilance, and you pay 3, put a 1/1 white soldier into the battlefield.
This is definitely my pick so far. I think this is a decent rate, and I kind of, you know, having played your mono black cube, I'm a little bit concerned these games will be kind of grindy with not a lot of ways of generating a lot of card advantage. And I see there are no planeswalkers in this environment either, which is one of the ways I'd look to do that. And, you know, Mobilization lets me always do something on mana and really grind out games if we get stuck in some kind of stall. So I think that's my pick so far.
Yeah, I think it does depend on how aggressive the most aggressive cards are, because at paying 6 mana to get your first 1/1, that is pretty slow to get started.
For sure.
I guess it's like giving your other soldiers is also possibly a thing. Just even looking at this one pack, we have multiple other soldiers here, so that's something else I would look out for.
I feel like with 180 white cards, there's going to be some incidental soldier stuff going on just by, you know, law of large numbers. So, yeah, that's my pick so far, I think. I'm not sure if it's right, but that's what I'm going to take.
All right, moving on, we have, skipping a bunch of black cards. Another familiar card, a Johnny's Pridemate. So
okay.
It's a
Life
2 mana
gain payoff,
2/2.
sure.
Whenever you gain life, put a 1 counter on it.
I would not be looking to take something that build aroundy at this stage, not knowing the cube super well. So I'm off that.
Fair enough.
Though it is a very
all right.
good floor. It's worth noting. Like if you're just building a beatdown deck, like having a bear as the floor is perfectly serviceable. So you don't need a ton of life gain to make it worth it.
And there's definitely at least some. So I think that would be something to
I would expect
consider.
there is some in the cube if we're seeing a Johnny's Pridemate as a card that's included, but not knowing the sort of depth of that, I think I'm still in Mobilization here.
All right, next card, Silverflame Squire. This is one of the adventure cards from Eldraine. So it's 2 mana for a 2/1, but it comes with the instant. For 3 mana, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and untap it.
I think Squire is better. I think I'll take Squire here. We've seen a lot of 2-drops, so I'm starting to get the sense that some kind of aggressive deck is supported, though I'd like to see a lot of 1-drops in that deck. And this is just, I think these adventure cards are just really, really good. I think having the ability to put a combat trick in your deck without having the risk of the combat trick being completely dead because you can't cast it is very powerful. So I think I'm on the Squire now.
Squire seems good.
What about you?
All right.
Are you on Squire too, or you disagree with me on any of these points so far?
No, I think I'm definitely on the Squire over the Pridemate or Mobilization, but I actually think my pick so far would be the White Shield Crusader. Like I said, protection from half the cube seems very strong. Yeah. And also these like really intense costs of just paying an activated ability that costs just white. That's pretty challenging in a multicolor deck, but it seems pretty likely that we'll just play that and play mono white and have no issues.
Yeah, I'm curious how often it makes sense. It seems like you're maybe never correct to play 2 colors in this 2-color cube, just from the lack of fixing lands and the fact that there are going to be so many cards in 1 color open that I feel like you're probably the advantage of running just basic lands of one type and never getting, mana screwed and stuck on color is probably worth running slightly weaker cards.
Yeah. All right, next card is pretty easy. We got Mistral Charger. It's a 2-mana, 2/1 flyer.
Another good aggressive creature, but I'll take Squire over this.
Yeah, I think in an aggressive deck, I'd rather have Squire most of the time.
I do think the evasion is very valuable, and this is an environment where we're not going to have stuff with reach, so it's really just flyers hitting other flyers, and most of those flyers, I guess there's a lot of flying demons in black. I guess white and black are both kind of secondary in flyers, so the flying seems relevant, but I'm not going to take a Charger over a Squire.
All right, we've got a weird one. I've never seen this card before. We have Jotun Grunt. 2-mana 4/4, cumulative upkeep. So 2-mana 4/4.
I'm pretty good. So far I'm in.
Cumulative upkeep, put 2 cards in a single graveyard on the bottom of their owner's library.
So this is the second kind of like self-mill card we've seen. This and the Angel that needs Delirium. Both these cards would expect me to find ways in this cube to put an inordinate amount of cards in my graveyard. This is a cumulative upkeep too, so before you get to attack with it once, you're putting 2 cards on the bottom of someone's library, and then after that, you got to find 4. So, doesn't seem very good to me.
Seems like this is just never going to work on turn 2. It's a really interesting design and like a fun way to twist cumulative upkeep, but yeah, I have trouble imagining that really working.
Yeah, I'm not taking this and not optimistic about how good it is. Although I am noticing that theme we're seeing now with the Angel and this, which seem to suggest there are ways to dump inordinate amounts of cards in the graveyard. So maybe that's a theme to look out for.
Or do you think in any way it's less of an aggressive card, but actually a way to interact with the graveyard that might be relevant late game?
Yeah, I mean, it is also that. It's a form of grave hate. I mean, I would never play it for that reason, because the grave hate is, it has to be specific numbers, and it's only, on your upkeep, and you don't get to, do it in response to anything or at instant speed. So, I wouldn't run it for that reason if I was looking explicitly for grave hate, but I can definitely see edge cases where it does stuff, gets rid of the reanimation target or whatever, their flashback spell.
All right, then we have an arguably white card, Razor Golem, 6-mana 3/4, not great. Vigilance and Affinity for Planes. So effectively, if you're in mono white, I guess you'd call this a 3-mana 3/4 with Vigilance, and actually goes up after that. If you draw it late, it might just be a free spell.
That seems very good to me. What do you think of Razor Golem?
I do like it. Again, it's you're only going to play it in a mono white deck, but that seems to be where you're going to be half the time here. I don't want to put it in my deck if I'm also playing Jace the Mind Sculptor. But I still think I like the protection from black creature more than just an efficient body.
Now I'm kind of torn. I think at this point I'm still just going to take Squire. Though I think if you do end up mono white, I think the Razor Golem is very high upside. Is this the kind of environment where we have to figure out if white is open in our seat? Is that a thing?
I don't think so. Half the players are going to be drafting white, and the idea of every other player drafting white is kind of ridiculous. It's not going to be perfect. People are not going to have that many fine-tuned card evaluations about what's going around the table. So it's gonna be kind of a mixture. I think more importantly, maybe after pack 1, you'll feel that one color is more open than the other, and that's kind of the best signal you're gonna get.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm still on Squire, but I think right now I'm falling a little bit prey to just familiarity bias. I know Squire, I know it's good. Razor Golem is an unknown quantity to me, but seems like the upside could definitely be there. I mean, getting to play this super cheaply.
Bigger question is, how often are you actually going to draft a 2-color deck in this cube? I feel like it's got to be pretty unlikely, right?
I don't want to. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm really advantaged if I am not worried about hitting both colors of mana. Because again, there are no fixing lands that I can see in this list while looking at it. So,
I think what would make me want to do that is if there's really strong synergies that cross the 2 colors. So, for example, if we have a Johnny's Pride Mate, if we see a bunch of black cards that also are either powerful payoffs or enablers for life gain, that would be a motivation. But if I'm just playing an aggro deck or a control deck full of removal and ways to gain card advantage, then I don't necessarily see a reason to stretch.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm definitely not. My first inclination is to try to play a single color. So far, I'm on Squire, I think. Most flexible card, and go from there.
All right, last white card might change your mind. We have Pearl Medallion. 2 mana, white spells you cast cost 1 less.
Yeah, that's definitely my pick. I think it's really powerful.
Yeah.
It's it's basically like Signet plus. Like if your deck is actually mono white, then the chance that you get to multi-spell in a turn and get 2 mana off this thing and it only costs 2 mana, that's a very high upside. We don't see. I've never played limited, frankly, with any of the medallions, but and I wouldn't take them highly in a normal environment because if I'm a 2-color deck, for example, not being able to use my quote unquote mana rock to fix my mana, or sometimes having it not work on the big spell I need to cast would be too much, too much of a coin flip. But here, if I'm playing mono white, I think this is very powerful, and I think I'm definitely taking the medallion.
Yeah, 100% in for Medallion. All right, let's look at the black cards. Number 1, Paralyze. Target creature is not untapped. Oh my god. Target creature is not untapped as normal during untap phase. Okay. Creature's controller may spend 4 mana during the turn. Okay, so
this is an aura. I'm looking at it now. This is a black aura that is basically a claustrophobia variant, except that the controller of the creature can pay 4 to untap it during their untap step, which I think is very strong, frankly. I mean, I've never seen this card before, but that's a huge tempo swing. In any kind of aggressive deck, removing a threat and making them pay 4 to untap it, which means that they're not going to also be casting spells that turn or whatever, seems very good to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I guess technically worse than claustrophobia that they can pay to untap it, but paying 4 mana to untap their creature is basically like casting another creature, so it almost feels like it doesn't matter.
Right, and it's a third of the mana of claustrophobia. I think his card's probably better than claustrophobia. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with it. I'm not taking it, though. I'm not going to start, I don't think, on a 1-for-1 removal spell, even a fairly efficient one like this. It is essentially like a pacifism or claustrophobia variant, so if the creature has some relevant activated abilities or whatever, or triggered abilities, those will not be turned off. But yeah, I feel like in black and white, I think the bar for removal is quite high, and so even though this is kind of a pleasant surprise of a card I've never heard of before, I don't think I'm taking it.
Are you looking at this on Scryfall? Is there a new printing that has more readable text?
I don't know. I'm looking at it on the Cube page.
All right.
I'm not looking at it on Scryfall.
Okay, next card, Undying Evil. I wonder what that does. Target creature gains Undying until end of turn and becomes
does what it
evil.
says right on the tin.
So yeah, Undying, if it would die, it returns from the graveyard with a 1/1 counter.
This is bottom of the pack for me so far. I don't want conditional stuff like this unless I need to have it for some reason. Like, I would maybe start to consider cards like this once I had really, really important things to protect, but not what I want to be doing.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm a huge sucker for these kinds of cards. Like, when they end up working, they just feel great, but it is very situational. I will say, what's the one from Amonkhet that was a very similar card? Gave a creature +2/+0 and returned it to the battlefield.
Great question. I can't remember.
Whatever it's called, I will be replacing that in my commander deck with this because that's cool.
Oh, there you go. This is even better.
All right, next card, Tormented Hero. So all the heroes have this effect that when you target them with stuff, something happens. So it's a 1 mana 2/1, enters the battlefield tapped, and its heroic ability is whenever you cast a spell that targets it, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain life equal to the amount of life lost that way.
This is the first true full aggressive card that we've seen. I would consider the heroic text basically trinket text here and expect to never trigger it. Even given that, I would take it kind of high if I was playing an aggressive deck. But it's not good enough to pull me into an aggressive deck, personally. So I'm off the Tormented Hero.
Yeah, totally fair. And compared to Pearl Medallion, I don't think this is an appealing pick.
I'm feeling like it's going to be hard to unseat Pearl Medallion. That seems like a very good place to start to me. But let's see. Maybe I'll be surprised.
Agree. All right. We've got Revenge of Ravens coming up next. It's a 4-mana gem. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker, that creature's controller loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life.
Notoriously groan-worthy in Eldraine Limited. This card ended up being very relevant in that limited environment. I don't think I would want it here. I mean, we're seeing some life gain. We saw the Ajani's Primate earlier, so this would work in some kind of life gain deck. but just on its face as a way to, affect the race and protect your life total and disincentivize attacks, I think it's going to be a little slow for this environment, given how many 2-drops and the 1-drop we've seen. It seems like aggro is probably pretty well supported.
But you don't think this is a great answer to aggro?
I don't think this is a great answer to aggro, in as much as, you play it on turn 4 or whatever. How much life is it going to save you in the next turn, and is that life more or less than if you just played another blocker, a blocker that could often trade for a creature? No, I feel like this card is better the slower the environment is. The worse aggro is, I think, the better this card gets. And then there is a limit to that, like at the point where everyone's playing like essentially some kind of control deck with just big giant finishers that only attack a few times, then it obviously gets worse. But anywhere in that sort of mid-range territory is where I think it shines.
Okay.
Do you
I
disagree?
feel like it's going to perform a little bit better in this environment than you're giving it credit, just because we are seeing a lot of pretty cheap creatures. I mean, imagine your opponent has mobilization and they're cranking out 1/1s. It completely destroys those.
Oh, yeah. Mobilization is not good against Revenge of Ravens. That is definitely true. I will say that if the life gain trigger stuff ends up being really relevant, then it starts to become, I think, much more scary. If every time you gain life, stuff happens.
I'm not that excited about it for life gain matters specifically, because your opponent has all the control. Like, if you have something that does some incredibly powerful effect whenever you gain life, your opponent just effectively just can't attack you. I think where it is
sounds pretty good to
when...
me.
That's a good point.
No, I hear what you're saying. You're very right that I think people very often overrate cards where their opponent gets some kind of choice, right? Like, these are like traditionally the Punisher cards, stuff like Browbeat, and then the Risk Factor, which is the Browbeat variant with Jumpstart. There's that Devil. I'm so bad with card names. What's the one man? Vexing Devils. Vexing Devil is a great example of a card that people read it and they're like, oh, this must be like a incredible card in an aggro deck, because it's either a 1-mana 4/4 or it's 1 mana deal 4 to your opponent's face, which both those rates are very, very good. But the thing is, your opponent always gets to choose the option that's better for them. And everybody I know that has tested Vexing Devil in a powered cube basically says it's way worse than Jackal Pup, even though it looks like it might have so much more value. And that's because it's hard to overstate how much giving your opponent that choice makes a card a lot worse.
Yeah, for sure.
Have they?
All right,
Anthony, do you know have they ever printed a Punisher card that is actually good enough to see competitive play? I think Risk Factor is the closest they've gotten, unless you can think of one I can't think of.
That is the best I can think of as well.
Yeah, I mean those effects, even when they seem pushed, it's so bad to give your opponent a choice.
And with Risk Factor, it was specifically because it had I'm going to forget the name of it.
Jumpstart.
I want to say it was called Jumpstart, right?
Yes.
So it actually, when you had it cast against you, it wasn't just looking at 4 damage, it's actually looking at 8 damage effectively, which was much more potent.
Yeah, I think it is a much better card than Browbeat. I ran in my cube for a little while and eventually just cut it for it's the kind of card that supplements an already successful aggro strategy, but in and of itself doesn't actually advance the aggro strategy so much. And I just felt like I had very little room for those kind of cards. So it definitely pulls its weight, but I cut it from my cube eventually.
All right, we've got an interesting last card here, another enchantment, Tainted Remedy. So it's 3 mana. If an opponent would gain life, that player loses that much life instead.
Seems like pure sideboard, right? I mean, how many... Is it possible to build a deck that intentionally gains your opponent life and then get them with this enchantment? I really doubt it.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, this feels like a sideboard card, and probably, by my reckon, the worst card in the pack we've heard so far.
Yeah.
Is that the last card in the pack?
That is the last card.
All right, I am definitely on Pearl Medallion. It's not particularly close for me. I feel like that's a very good place to start, and it will work in basically any strategy, though I especially am looking to be either mid-range or more controlling once I have essentially a mana rock.
Yeah, I'm 100% in the same camp. I think if that wasn't there, a lot of those black cards are not really appealing to me. I could definitely see after drafting this environment a couple times, the aggressive cards definitely going up in value, and also Paralyze, the removal spell, could also go up in value if that seems to play out well in this environment. But for me, it's really between Pearl Medallion and the White Shield Crusader.
Yeah, I don't have a
with the
great
Pearl Medallion
sense
standing
of
out.
how good that protection is. It's probably quite good. So I think that's probably a good second pick. If you've kind of talked me into that one, though, I do think Squire overperforms. It's funny because the Squire overperforms in the same way that Punisher cards underperform. Like, you think, well, these two modes or whatever, they're fine. But the fact that you get to have the choice and use whichever one is better for you and give it sort of board state and try and navigate things to a point where you get the max value, it makes it very good. But Pearl Medallion. Also, I'm noticing there is basically no ramp in this environment. There are very, very few ramp spells. It looks like each color has a medallion and a diamond, and that appears to be it in the entire cube, which makes me feel even better about taking it early because it seems like gaining some kind of mana advantage is something that will not be available to most of my opponents. And so if I get to do that, then I get to cast things ahead of schedule and out-tempo them. So I'm feeling pretty good about that.
So how good do you feel about Jace the Mind Sculptor?
Would we take Jace over Pearl Medallion? You go first, Anthony. Would you take Jace out of this pack if it were in the pack?
Not over Pearl Medallion.
Would you take it over the next best card in the pack, whatever you decided it was, the knight or whatever?
Possibly. So I think there's two considerations that I have. The first is, are we just otherwise consistently playing a monocolor deck? And I think that the answer for me, just looking at the list, is yes, I'm probably going to be playing a monocolor deck almost all the time. So then the comparison becomes, well, if I'm already just willing to say I want to commit to mono black, is Jace actually better than the best card in the other opposite in white or black, that it is a more reasonable splash? And I think also yes.
I think Jace is a lot better than all the other cards that we talked about, basically. I mean, it is worth noting that like we saw a lot of cards that either had very demanding mana costs. The first net we talked about, is white to cast, and it has all white pips in order to activate its abilities. We saw things like the Razormane Golem, which even if you are in a monocolored deck, you don't really want to be playing Golem in a deck. It's also playing 4 Iwins or whatever to try and splash Jace. Jace is double blue. That's really challenging. I still think, and to be clear, Jace could be in this cube by a total accident because it doesn't fit anything at all, and maybe this whole really conversation is moot. But I do think I would take Jace pretty highly in this environment, and my reasoning is that I would try and be either mono black or mono white splashing Jace. Obviously, not going to go full Esper, and I feel like as long as I avoid the really high devotion cards, my mana base doesn't suffer that much. If I'm running 17 versus 12, white sources or whatever. Most of the cards are going to have a single white source requirement, maybe some doubles as you get up into the higher converted mana costs. But, any 2-color mana base with 12 of one of the colors is in a very good spot. And then the potential upside of the only Planeswalker in the environment, the only reliable sort of dedicated source of card advantage that I've seen here, that is just its sole job is to draw cards and generate advantage. It just seems like really high upside. And also it'd be fun to try and make work your mono white deck splashing Jace.
I think I just figured it out. This whole environment, this whole story of these two different motivations and ethos, it's all just Jace's dream.
It is 361 cards too, so you could sit down to a draft with your friends, and then Jace could be the one card that wasn't included in the packs.
One card in the middle of the table.
At the end of the draft. Who got the Jace? Oh, nobody did? It's the one extra card. All right, Chris, thank you for sending in your cube. I didn't even make a joke about the front man of Coldplay listening to our podcast. I'm sure Chris gets it all the time. It's got to be very frustrating. And I didn't make the joke, even though I just referenced the fact that I didn't. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, then send an email to mail@luckypaper.co and give us a link to your cube, give us your name or how you want to be identified, whether it's your screen name or whatnot, and give us your pronouns, and we will put you on the list of cubes to draft. We got to draft my cube over the weekend. It was kind of a belated birthday draft for me. I got to coerce my friends into playing my cube. And I had this dream of doing a team draft because I do love team drafting. And this particular team draft ended up being kind of an aborted team draft because we had one person drop last minute, unfortunately. And after some deliberating, I just decided to draft 2 seats to keep the normal team dynamics. So it was basically me and one other player on Team A. I drafted 2 seats in my cube simultaneously. I tried as much as possible not to, gain advantage from that and like try and pass myself cards or whatever. I just tried to basically draft each deck as if I was, isolated in that seat. And then we played the games afterwards. Anthony, you drafted a kind of nice mono red deck, and did you drop any games? I know you won both your matches. Did you drop any games?
It's hard to remember. I doubt it.
It's hard to remember. I doubt it. There's a couple things to unpack here, Anthony. So one is we could talk about team drafting, which you and I had an interesting conversation about this. So let's just explain team drafting for those that are not familiar. This is a format that Wizards has formerly done at competitive events. If you go to a limited GP, I'm not sure what GPs are anymore, or if you're ever playing Paper Magic ever again. But it used to be that a limited GP would be, there could be team limited events. And team limited events would be team sealed on day one, and then usually some more team sealed on day two. But then like the top 8 or whatever, the top 2 teams would do a team draft against each other. And the way that works is you have 3 players on each team, and you sit intermingle with the other team. So on your right or left is going to be a player from the opposite team. So around the table it's AB, AB, AB. And then you draft normally, 15 card packs, passing left, passing right, passing left, and then you still build a deck with your pool of cards. There's no sharing of cards with your other teammates. But the interesting thing about this format is that it's very different dynamics than a regular draft, because there's a well-established rule in regular drafting that hate drafting is just not a good strategy. And the reason for that is because, if you are sitting at your seat and you're drafting a sick white-red deck and you open some green mythic bomb in pack 3, taking that card to deprive the nearest green player of a big bomb in their deck may seem like it's good, because you're like, I might have to play against them. They'll have this green bomb. I can't beat it. But actually what's happening is you're passing up on a good playable or whatever, some bread and butter card for your own deck in that pack. For a player you might not even play against. Even if you do play against them, they might not even draw their bomb. So basically, like, the statistics of like the chances of you playing against a single card just does not ever reward hate drafting in a normal draft environment. But in team draft, it is zero sum. So every game that your team wins is a win for your team. It doesn't matter who is playing in it. So if you can make your opponent's deck worse and make them lose their games, regardless of who they're playing against, that benefits you. So this means that if you're doing a team draft of a normal retail and limited environment, there's all sorts of changed equations that basically kind of summarize to be that you should take the card out of the pack that is not going to make your deck the best, but is going to have the greatest like net impact on the table in terms of making your deck better, making your opponent's deck worse. You have this kind of scales to balance. But Anthony, I know you are skeptical of the value of hate drafting in a team draft format, specifically as it pertains to Cube. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why.
So everything you said makes perfect sense. And if we're drafting a retail limited set, if I open up pack 2, let's say I'm mono blue at this point, and I open up a Glory Bringer, if I pass that, it's 100% going to get played, and it's going to get played against all of my opponents. It's going to have a big effect. So like you said, it's a zero-sum game. I'm going to take that Glory Bringer because removing it from my opponent is as valuable as if I was actually going to put it into my own deck.
Right.
But in a cube, all of the cards are kind of good. At least, obviously cubes can be whatever you want. But in something like your Legacy cube, all of the cards are good. I do not trust my card evaluation skills enough, or think any particular card is critical enough to somebody's strategy that at least early in packs, it's worth actually taking something away from my opponents. Because I think it's just as likely that somebody who has like slightly different card evaluations would just pass it, and I'd end up actually be hate drafting cards from my allies instead of from my opponents.
I think this is a really good point you made, and for me, it's that I still think there are definitely times where hate drafting is correct, and those examples are like, there are key cards, I think, to strategies. In my cube specifically, playing a control deck with no board wipes, for example, is going to be hard for you. It's going to be a hard go. Aggro is quite good in my environment. Mid-range puts a lot of threats on the board. If you don't have some way to generate a big card advantage by, wiping the board with a Wrath of God or a Balance or something, it can be very hard to actually build a control deck. So I do think there are key cards. So I think in those situations, it can make sense to say, I think my opponent might be playing a control deck. I'll take this key card from them. What I do think is 100% correct, though, is that in a normal retail limited pack, the power band is much wider, as you said, which means that you can kind of look at the pack, and oftentimes reasonable players will pretty much have a consensus about, like, well, this is obviously the bomb mythic rare, and then after that, there's like a really good removal spell in a particular color. Then after that, there's like a key, staple common that, all the colors like. And those 3 cards are just kind of, 1, 2, 3 in the pack, such that if you're really early on in the draft, you can pretty safely assume, if I pass this mythic rare of this really good removal spell, this person sitting directly to my left or right is going to take it. And I agree with you completely. That is the thing that you basically can never assume in Cube. The way most cubes are built. As you said, like, a cube can be anything. There definitely can be cubes that have as wide of a power band as a normal limited pack, but we don't see that very often in the cube world, I think for good reason. So with most cubes where there's a narrower band of power, and like you said, reasonable players can completely disagree on what's good or bad. This is a thing that comes up in the cube world all the time. I think it's basically impossible to figure out what your immediate neighbors are drafting based on what you're passing them, which means that you don't know who you're hating from at the end of the day.
Right, and especially if everybody else is also trying to hate draft. Maybe they took something they thought was pretty good, but maybe not what they're usually in their style that they like to play, but they thought it was worth hate drafting, and now they end up going in a totally different direction. I think it just adds so much noise to the system that it's going to be impossible to do it effectively.
Yeah, I think you pretty much sold me on your theory of hate drafting not being super viable in most cube environments. I do want to give a shout out to Team Draft. I still think it's a great format to play with. This is especially great if you only have 6 people. It's designed for 6 people because the way you play the games is you just play a round against each of the opposing members' players. So that's 3 rounds, and then whoever wins the most games in those rounds, I guess the first to 5 wins or whatever, takes the whole thing. So I think it's a great draft environment for 6 players, and it's really fun to get to build your deck with your teammates, and if you finish your game early, to actually help them out mid game. I think that's one of the more fun social parts of Magic for me. So I will shout out Team Draft and say people should try it if you haven't.
Right, so the shtick is you're still drafting on your own. You can't get assistance from your teammates during the draft, but you can deck build together, and then there's sort of this fun dynamic, especially if you're fortunate enough to not be in the middle of a zombie apocalypse and be able to actually see people face to face. As games finish, you end up going and following and actually being very invested in the games that are happening because it's win or lose for the whole team. So that's a really fun aspect of it. It's not just like, oh, my match is over, I'll just like twiddle my thumbs until the next round.
Yeah, I think Team Limited is great, both in a retail environment and also for Cube. I think it's a lot of fun. So
I don't think I've ever actually drafted a retail limited team draft.
Interesting. I know I've done it before a few times. Mostly we've done Team Seal. We did a Team Seal GP once, right, which was fun.
Yeah, and Team Seal is similar. It's like all of the value of it being a team event is just from that sort of camaraderie and being able to get like input and feedback from your teammates.
Well, Team Sealed, your decks are also much better because you do get to build from one pool. So you get
that's right.
You get higher peaks on those decks because you get a bigger pool to pull from. So that's a really fun. I mean, if Sealed wasn't already complicated enough, we talked a little bit about Sealed on a previous show and how much I like it and how complicated I think it is to actually build the pool correctly. Take a full 18 packs and try and build the best 3 decks out of it, and there's so much complexity there, and it's something that I think is really, really skill intensive and rewards skilled, experienced players. So, good format. Love to see it.
You just gave me the best idea. So I think we talked a little bit about how sealed cube specifically can be very challenging because you're dealing with so many cards that have like small synergies and cards that have like very high power level. It's not just like a normal limited set where it's like, oh, here's my 3 bombs and I have like twice as many blue cards as anybody else. Let's just shuffle it up.
Right, and again, a narrow power band, so you're not going to look at your pool and be like, ooh, here are my 4 cards I obviously have to play because they're so incredible. It doesn't happen that way.
Exactly.
You got a lot of cards that are really good.
But what if you do team sealed cube? Then you actually have an opportunity to try and build multiple decks out of it. And again, like even with regular team sealed, you do have this challenge of saying like, okay, well, which colors actually fit together best? And how do we want to try and split up our most powerful cards?
I will try this with you. I think those decks are going to be disgustingly powerful.
That sounds great.
Like, I imagine most of them would break down as like, one either mono white or mono red. In my cube specifically, one either mono white or mono red aggro deck for one player, one green X mid range deck, and one blue X control deck. Probably for most groups of 3, and you have, 180 cards to build the best control deck you could without having to overlap with a mid range or aggro deck. Seems seems like it'd be a high ceiling on those decks.
I think that bigger risk, like the high power level seems exciting.
Yeah.
The bigger risk is that, like you said, there might actually end up being a pretty easy strategy, and it would be less about, like, how do we optimize this, but more like, okay, we've got the template, we've kind of figured this out. So I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't a ton of replay value to that experience.
I would definitely try it, though. One thing I've always wanted to do with my cube, and I'm not sure I've ever uttered this aloud, is I've wanted to ask, a bunch of players in our local play group or whatever, or online, to just build the best 40-card deck they could from the pool of cards in my cube. Like, the whole pool's available to you. Like, build what you think is the objectively best deck, with the understanding you're going to be playing in a meta against other people doing exactly the same thing, and then playing a little tournament of, like, cube constructed to see how that shook out. I think it'll be a very interesting experiment, because my first inclination is like, oh, you just go dedicated all-in aggro, but if you think dedicated all-in aggro is, like, the best strategy when you have perfect card selection, you can definitely build a deck that is designed to beat that all-in aggro deck. And you already get into some metagaming, which I think would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is. Have you never done that even just for testing?
No, I have never had other people. I think I've sat down before and, like, just at least in my head, been like, ooh, here's my ideal 40-card, mid-range deck or whatever. But I've never asked other people to do it. I've never played games with two, like, completely constructed decks only from the pool of cards available in my cube.
It's almost at that point like a sort of weird block constructed, where you're saying,
yeah,
we want to play constructed, but I guess it's also singleton, so that's a wrinkle. But you have this, like, really weird specific pool.
It would also be interesting to me to ask, like, a dozen people to do it and see which archetypes and colors and specific cards popped up the most often. Like, does every deck just run Ancient Tomb? Like, is that, just a shoo-in, basically, no matter what you're doing? I don't know. It'd be very interesting to find out sometime. Perhaps we will do it in the future.
I think that's another thing that would change a lot depending on the specific cube. I think there is that interesting, like, meta gameplay you described in your environment. I think that would break down a little bit in powered environments, where you just be like, okay, great, like, we just play Black Lotus, we play all the Moxen. Like, I think it would be to some degree more solvable. At the same time, maybe then there is a different kind of metagame where it's like, okay, I'm, like, clearly Tinker Blightsteel is the obvious best deck, and I can, like, get a turn 1 win every time, but then if Force of Will is also in the cube, that starts to fall apart. So maybe it would be different, but there still could be some interesting metagame play.
Yeah, I kind of feel like no matter what the nature of the cube was, if you had inquisitive players that were trying to, determine and break the meta, there'd be a lot of back and forth before you settle on any kind of one established thing. Frank Carson has done some really interesting writing about how metas develop. Specifically, one of my favorite articles of his is the No Limit Modern article, which is it's a super fun thought experiment in the first place. And his thought experiment is just, what if we abolish the 4-card limit in Modern? And for those of you who haven't read the article, the first deck he proposes is just 60 copies of Chancellor of the Dross, which is just a card that says you can reveal it from your opening hand and drain your opponent for 3, which of course just, turn 0, drains your opponent for 21. But this is not the best deck in No Limit Modern. There are a number of competing decks that can possibly beat it. So if you've not read that article, I suggest checking it out. I will put it in the show notes. It's a good one. The other storyline of our draft this weekend, Anthony, was that I continue to do poorly at my own cube, which is a deep, profound shame that I'm actually just a little bit embarrassed to talk about on the podcast.
Don't be so hard on yourself. I'm sure you do fine.
I mean, I do fine, but I hear this often from other cube designers, on Discords and Reddits and stuff, where they're like, oh, I want my friends to draft my cube, but because I designed it, I know it so well that I always just beat them all so badly. Like, what? How can I solve this problem? And I'm like, oh, cool, great problem to have, nice. Yeah, I mean, I've had my cube now for 3.5-ish years, almost 4 years, and I can pretty safely say that over that entire period of time, I think my win percentage in my own cube, oftentimes against the same players that I play other formats with, is lower than it is in Retail Limited. It's lower than it is with other people's cubes. I just, I'm like a little cursed in my own cube. I don't do as well as I would like to do, and I don't know what to attribute that to. But yeah, this time I even have this, unfair advantage, which you said before the draft was just so broken, and I was going to dumpster everybody, where I got to draft 2 seats simultaneously. And I ended up basically going, 0-2-1 in my matches. I didn't have time to finish the third match, but lost both my matches, which was disappointing.
That is pretty mind-boggling. I don't. That's
My mind is boggled at how much you screwed that up. It's amazing you could be so bad when you had such an advantage.
Let's touch on how this happens. So, right, team draft. It's all about hate drafting. Information is extremely valuable. I mean, maybe we should even just step back and say, like, the act of drafting well is largely just figuring out what is most open at the table. Like, that is the question. If you can solve that, then you're in great shape. So, in this particular draft, we are at a 6-person table, and you are drafting 2 of the seats.
Yes, and by nature of team draft, my 2 seats are 1 seat apart, meaning that because I can't be across the table from myself, because across the table from myself has to be someone on the opposite team. So I am always just 1 seat between myself, depending on which direction I'm passing, as I'm passing these cards around the table.
So you know what you're taking. You know what you number 2 is taking. Yes. Which means you also can figure out literally every pick of the person in between yous.
Right. So if I really wanted to min-max this, then you're absolutely right that I could have taken notes. I could have taken notes and known exactly what the person in between me was drafting, and thus perfectly hate drafted against them, and made sure I stayed out of their lane so they would pass me all the good cards in my colors. But that is just a huge amount of mental overhead. Like, it's hard to imagine how that would be even possible. And, having actually tried this too, like, I was intentionally kind of not trying to min-max it, but I got confused as to which direction the packs were even going half the time, even though I was drafting both decks. I was like, is that pack going to me immediately, or is it going around the table first? Like, I just couldn't remember which way they were going. It's a lot of information to understand. So while you're correct, I would theoretically have a big advantage. I think in reality, my only advantage, which was a significant one, is that obviously I didn't cut myself. So I didn't play the same color in both of my decks, which is no doubt a big advantage of knowing that, one of the players passing to me is not going to be cutting me at least. But I really think that was kind of the sum total of the advantage that I had the way I was drafting this.
Interesting. So yeah, I guess the con side is, one, that you are it's just like a much bigger cognitive load to try and be drafting 2 decks at once. So you are definitely stretched there. And then the other issue is you're maybe too honest of a person, and you're sitting there like intentionally trying not to overutilize that information. And I think that trying to you're also adding extra cognitive load of trying to think about it in a certain way.
Yeah, and I got to play one of the decks twice, and I played the worst deck twice, and I played the deck I think is better only once. And my worst deck was a black-white aggro deck, and it was not great because it wasn't... If I'm going to play 2-color aggro, I really want it to be heavily in one color and maybe just splashing a few key cards of a second color. And just the nature of a 6-person draft and the way this sort of table broke down, that archetype was open, but I didn't really get enough playables to be mono-white or mono-black, and so I had to basically be, split down the middle. I had 1-drops in both colors, which is not where I want to be. So that deck was not amazing, but still won some games. And my much better deck, which was this, I think, green-red mid-range deck, which I think was very strong, actually. The one match I played with it, I kind of got cheesed out by an Elspeth. I got killed from 7 or whatever by an Elspeth, which I didn't expect. When I was way ahead on board, they just gave something flying and punched my head in. So that's how you lose games of Magic. But yeah, so I was trying to stay a little bit out of my... Obviously, I was not cutting myself, but beyond that, it was really quite easy for me just to isolate decisions on one deck or the other. And it helps that the way we're drafting is the packs will pile up, right? So I oftentimes go over to one deck and pick 3 or 4 cards all at once, and then go over to the other deck and pick 3 or 4 cards all at once. I wasn't going kind of onesie twosie and keeping track of where the packs were at the table.
Did you strategize at all before, or were you really just I'm just going to approach this like 2 normal drafts?
No, I didn't strategize before. What do you mean? Basically decide, hey, right hand, you're going to play control, and hey, left hand, you're going to play aggro, premeditated?
Well, specifically what I thought, if I was to try and do the same thing, is I would probably actually try the opposite approach and just force the same color with both packs.
Interesting.
Specifically with the reasoning of, if you can control what 2 drafters are doing at the table, you can make it very clear that a color is not open. And possibly go with, maybe choose mono black and just say, well, I know that there is both an aggro and a control deck supported here, so I can get cards that still fit in 2 different decks, but make it very clear to the rest of the table that you cannot draft black.
I did not take any meta strategy like the one you described. I don't know if I buy that strategy you just laid out for a couple of reasons.
Very cheap.
One reason, we talked on a previous episode about how, trying to intentionally send signals in a pack is not a great strategy. And to your point, here you're controlling 2 of the drafters at the table instead of 1, and it's only a 6-person table, so you're controlling a third of the drafters at the table instead of 1/8 of them. But that said, I would not have the confidence to say, like, all right, I'm just going to cut a color and everybody else will learn very quickly that that color is not open, because I feel like it's a very good chance that somebody who is going to see 3 packs before I get them at all is just going to be like, oh, an amazing black card, and then, 2 more great black cards, and then they have 3 good black cards now. And even though they probably should, if they're, Ben Stark style, drafting the right way, eventually figure out that black is not open, I feel like most players will not. And they'll say, I've got these 3 good black cards, I am a black deck, and they will continue to cut me on that color.
It's very possible. I will say, of all the things I would like to try in my Magic playing time, this is not high on my list, but I'm a little bit curious.
Trying to break 2-seat team draft.
Trying to break the 2-seat team draft.
People come to Lucky Paper Radio for the practical advice. So the next time that you're at a team draft and you're going to draft 2 seats because the tournament organizer has allowed it, you're going to need to have all this deep strategy in your pockets to pull out and really min-max that draft. The other reason I don't think forcing a color sounds great in my cube specifically is that I don't think there are any monocolored decks that are successful outside of mono green, which is one deck, just like mono green mid range, or the monocolored aggro decks. I don't think there's any one color where like there's a mono white aggro deck and also a mono white control deck. I think the control decks always need some kind of blue basically to be viable. That's fair. I basically just approached it as 2 simultaneous drafts, and I really didn't think about it much. And I ended up first picking a card on one hand that that color didn't feel open in that seat, and it ended up being open in the other seat. And so I'd actually hated a couple cards from myself essentially because I picked red cards over here, and then red was more open in the other seat, and so I ended up playing red on that side. Which maybe I'm just a total idiot and should have thought about that more. But I was really just kind of drafting it like 2 seats. And trying my best to keep it clean. Do
you remember the draft that we did? This was, I think, your sort of a draft design where we had 4 players and we each drafted 2 decks.
Yeah, so I borrowed a draft format from Ryan Spain of Limited Resources, which he calls Double Decker. And Double Decker is basically just a normal draft, but you take 2 cards out of every pack and then build 2 decks at your seat, which it's a very cool draft format. We only have 4 people. I think it works really nicely. I invented this overcomplicated variation that also basically accounts for the fact of you drafting 2 decks but not getting to pick 2 cards out of a pack simultaneously, which is a huge advantage, right? If you're looking at a whole pack and you get to take a card for 2 decks from it, that means that some packs you're going to take 2 cards for deck A, some packs you're going to take 2 cards for deck B. You don't always have to take 1 and 1, and you get to see what's open and very fully at your seat. So yeah, we have done a variant of Double Decker that I sort of worked on that was basically just you're drafting 2 seats at an 8-person table.
But the difference was, each pack you were still just taking 1 card, but what was the way there was a twist? Literally, there was an extra pack that took full planes or something.
The way that I did it is that there was basically we were passing an extra pack around the table, and the pack was just basic lands, and when you got that pack, you would count it as a pick for the deck of your choosing, which is or for the deck that was up next in your sort of draft order, which was a complicated way to basically make sure that you were always drafting the opposite seat from yourself at the theoretical 8-person table we were at. I'm going to do a write-up on this sometime because I think it's a cool format. It's a little bit complex, but it is a very faithful way to draft what feels like a normal 8-person table with only 4 people. And yeah, that I think does work pretty well, and I don't think there you have the sole advantage, which is, again, not cutting your own self. But even in that situation, I think it's very possible that both those colors would just be, or a given color would be open on both halves of the table, and it would be correct to play it in both decks, and you're not actually cutting yourself at that point because, you just found that this color is open in the entire table, and it's good to be, in both sides of it.
Right. I mean, at that point, basically, we were simulating exactly an 8-person draft where you were drafting 2 decks on opposite sides, in which case I think, my initial, like the way that I approached that draft was definitely just to try and draft what was open, and I ended up with two very different decks in non-overlapping colors. And then in retrospect, I was like, if I was actually drafting well at an 8-person table, I would kind of expect the person opposite for me to be in the same colors. So maybe I should have been more open to just taking cards of the same color.
Right, yeah. But basically what you're saying is that, like, if everyone at the table is quote-unquote drafting the hard way and paying attention to signals, then, you know, the ideal table, neither of your neighbors would be in either of your colors. And so if you kind of extrapolate that out to their neighbors not being in any of their colors, then the sort of most optical arrangement is oftentimes similar colors directly across the table from each other. So you're getting exactly half of the first shot at that color in all the packs. Yeah, maybe that is the way that particular draft format can be broken. It's possible.
So did this experience of trying to draft 2 seats at a 6-person table feel similar to that?
It did feel similar because I didn't try and metagame it any harder. It was just, I was just taking 2 cards out of each pack, or a card out of each pack for 2 different decks, and it did feel very similar to that, basically, for me, yeah. But advantages and all, I got bodied.
I do really like your twist on that double-decker draft a lot, though. I feel like, did you ever draft Battle Bond?
I actually never did a Battle Bond draft. That was a period of my life where I was trying not to spend money on retail Magic. And Battle Bond didn't really have a huge appeal for me, but I know you did a couple times, right?
I did a little bit, and I think what we all concluded pretty quickly, specifically with the draft, was that it wasn't that much fun. And the reason was just that because you were drafting 2 decks at once, you could presumably say, like, okay, ultimately we're going to end up playing most colors. Either we're going to play, 2 2-color decks, or maybe, a 2-color and a 3-2 with a splash. So basically any card you took was going to end up in a deck. You didn't have to choose which deck things went into as you drafted them, which meant that you didn't actually have to make any strategies in your draft. You just would take the best cards out of every pack, and you could just, like, follow a pick order and then figure out how to build the best decks later.
That's my only problem with Ryan Spain's double-decker format, is that if you're drafting 2 decks simultaneously, it's very, very reasonable, I mean, without stretching at all, to just say, I'm going to have 2 2-color decks, they won't overlap, that's 4 of the 5 colors, and then, having one of those decks having a little more mana fixing to be able to splash for amazing cards in that 5th color if you get past them doesn't seem like that much of a stretch to me. So, yeah, I was trying to solve that problem, basically, with my variation on the double-decker draft. Perhaps talking about it on this episode, Anthony, will make me finish the write-up about it that I have begun a long time ago.
Do it.
I will do it. But yeah, I just want to, public confession time. Just bad at my own cube, people. My record is not very good at my own cube, so I guess don't listen to me. It's great. I have a great way to people ask me, like, oh, what's good in the cube? I'm like, literally don't ask me. I don't know. I'm bad at my own cube. I get to deflect all those questions very, very, very adeptly.
Do you have any hypotheses?
I do feel like I am afflicted by the appeal of whatever recent things I've added to my cube. Like, I'm always thinking about specific sections of the cube or colors or archetypes that I'm trying to bolster. And I cannot help but open a pack and see, like, here's a card I just spent the last, 3 weeks thinking about, and, swapping out for something and, trying to, theory craft how this card will work in the cube. And so I just see it, and I see all those possibilities and opportunities where I might just pass up on a card that has been there forever. It's like a staple of the cube that, I might not be thinking about at the front of my mind. I try and consciously overcome that, and I think I fail a lot. And then there's also just, there are a couple things in my cube that maybe are not perfectly, I'm sure there's lots of things in my cube that are not perfectly balanced, but I feel like oftentimes I end up in the archetype that most of the players at the table have decided is no good because they're not taking the cards for that archetype, and I see those cards and know these are the indicators that this archetype is open, and so I draft that deck. And the one that's been really killing me lately, Anthony, is just mono black aggro, which I have been working to bolster my support of. I want black to be one of the aggressive colors. I want there to be 3 aggro decks in the cube, 3 monocolored aggro decks in the cube, and I keep getting pick 6 Dark Confidants and being like, okay, I guess I'm doing this again. But yeah, I have not put up good numbers for that one specifically recently.
So would you is it fair to say that you want to imagine that every archetype that you know is there, that you've intentionally designed into the cube, is equally viable? And so with that in mind, you end up seeing the archetype that the fewest people are looking to play.
Yeah, I think that's a very generous read, and I would like to say that is exactly what's happening. It could also just be that I am a bad Magic player and a bad drafter. But
I don't think that's worth discussing. broader than that, just this idea of you're approaching it very often as the designer of the cube, and it can be difficult to take a step back and not just say like, okay, well, what actually looks the most powerful here? What are the cards that look like they're going to get me to a win as quickly as possible? Instead, you're like looking at this meta game of all kinds of different archetypes and what could be powerful in what particular context, and like what you hope would be working.
I think that's definitely part of it too. I think I'm the most biased person with regards to my own cube, and probably the least equipped to make sort of unbiased evaluations about it, which is one of the reasons I value talking about cubes so much, because I feel like talking about other people's cubes, talking about card evaluation in more of a vacuum as much as possible, talking about those kinds of decisions, I think helps develop a more general understanding of the game that is not tied to specific context. But yeah, it's basically impossible for me not to look at a pack and see what I hope to be there, right? Like what I hope is viable and I hope people can take and make work, as opposed to just being like, well, actually that's too cutesy and I'm just not going to do that. I'm just going to take blue cards if blue cards are good. Like I don't end up in those kinds of situations as much.
Right. I felt similar the last time we drafted my cube, which has been a while. But I have this sort of grand vision of, if you're playing blue-red, you'll have these wee Dragonauts and Storm Chaser Mage, and you'll be building up to this crazy turn where you're casting 4 spells and killing your opponent out of nowhere. And the person that won the draft was playing blue-red, and they're just like, no, I don't want those like goofy, inconsistent cards. I'm just going to play like a Vision Removal and Counter Spells and Nadir Kraken because it's a extremely powerful Magic card and shouldn't be here. And that's a valuable lesson.
Yeah, that to me is, I would not describe my cube as an archetypal cube. I think yours is a little more defined in what you want the color pairs to be doing. Like there is a kind of definitive strategy, or somewhat definitive, for each color pair, at least as indicated by the gold cards. And I think the challenge with designing those cubes is trying to balance it such that your players are rewarded for doing the thing that you ostensibly want the archetype to do. And you described a use case here where the last time you drafted the cube, that some player completely ignored those signals and just said, I'm going to take good removal and good counter spells and cantrips and stuff and just go off with good cards. But also making it so you're not just railroading your players to saying like, well, here's the deck. This is what it does. So only take these cards and ignore everything else, which I know is not this is something you're trying to avoid. I think most cube designers would probably not want their draft environment to be so on rails. And I think that's a really difficult needle to thread where, players are rewarded for doing the defined strategy, but it is not so defined and so clearly like cordoned off from the rest of the cube that the draft just becomes a matter of course.
Right. I mean, that's the whole thing about designing any kind of limited environment, is you're trying to balance between cards that get better in certain context and not cards that what's the way to describe it?
I don't know, because I don't know what you're trying to describe.
You want to increase the opportunity to make interesting decisions as much as possible, at least like for the kind of playing that I want to cultivate.
Lots of viable options in each pack, for example.
Right. But at either extreme, either if cards are too narrow and they only work in one context, or on the other extreme, if they are equally powerful in all contexts, you have much fewer choices. Either you're on the sort of railroad of like, okay, I know I'm doing this now, I just take every elf and put it in my elf deck. Or it's just every card is powerful and nothing synergizes, I just take the best card out of every pack. And it's a different kind of thing. I'm not just looking for one specific synergy, one silo. Instead, I'm just like following a pick order. But you're still eliminating a lot of the opportunities for interesting decisions.
Yeah, I think those two extremes, they're obviously exaggerated a little bit. Like I think even in the most narrow linear archetype, there's still things like curve consideration and like, which of these 2 goblins am I going to take for my goblin tribal deck that I know I want to get as many goblins as possible? Do I want to prioritize this cheaper goblin or this bigger one with a flashier effect? I am going to need a number of removal spells. How do I balance my tribal stuff versus the stuff that isn't actually, strictly speaking, in my sort of linear lane? So I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. And the same at the other end, like,
sure.
It's basically impossible for me to imagine an environment even close to one where the cards... I mean, Magic is a game inherently where the cards interact with one another. So even if you are trying to play strictly just good stuff cards with no, build around as minimal variability as possible, like the number of collisions as soon as you just have a cube of 20 cards is just... There's already just huge numbers of possible combinations that are more or less powerful depending on just fundamental aspects of the card that can't be written off. So yeah, that spectrum definitely exists. I think that I think cube designers don't explore the extremes very much because they are afraid of the kind of gameplay you're describing. But I actually cannot imagine a cube that is either so linear that like I'm actually just drafting on rails, or one that is so wide open that there's like no decision to make because I just take the most powerful card out of every pack. I feel like that's not really even possible, actually.
No, I'm being completely hyperbolic. Like, I don't think you're ever going to reach either of those extremes, but I think you still do reduce some of the decision options, even if you're just leaning fairly heavily to either direction.
Did you consider that a like quote unquote problem with your cube that you wanted to solve when our buddy Day won that draft with the red blue deck that wasn't playing any Wii Dragonauts, or is that something you were like, that's cool, I'm glad my cube does that?
I mean, it's some of both. Like I think that ultimately it was a fun play experience, so that's what is ultimately valuable. But it definitely means like these cards are taking up space that isn't being utilized. So it's definitely something I'm going to try and work towards, either whether that means like lowering the power level a little bit, removing some of these other cards that just work on their own to motivate you to take gold cards more. But yeah, I definitely, if the idea of somebody saying, oh, I drafted this deck, you've never even considered that your cube could do this, that's fantastic. Like that's the best.
That's my favorite thing. The other thing about what we were saying that strikes me is that I feel like cube, unlike other formats of Magic, is like the most extreme in regards to experienced, skilled players that completely disagree on the power level of cards in a cube environment. I think this is largely because, you know, cube is not a thing that ever... I mean, the cube that gets the most attention and that gets played the most is the Magic Online Vintage Cube when it's up. But even that doesn't get anywhere near enough reps for like a clear meta of like, this is the best deck to be in to, you know, develop and sort of appear. So because we don't get to like, you know, point the full attention of a bunch of competitive Magic players at the format and say, solve this, break this as fast as you can, you know, let's figure out what the meta of this environment is. There's a lot of huge disagreements amongst skilled players about cards in cube. I thought we could close today, Anthony. I wanted to get your takes on a couple of very controversial cube cards and how good or bad you think they are. Does that sound good?
It does. I think that it's going to be challenging also because of the nature of cube. These cards are going to look different in every single environment, and we have so much like weird crosstalk between how we expect a card to perform based on how we've seen it perform in different environments. That I don't know if it's definitely not going to be easy to evaluate things in a vacuum. Are
you at all familiar with the Magic Online Cube? Have you watched people draft it before? Or do you have a sense of what that list looks like?
Yes, I have backseat drafted it one time.
Okay,
I have.
My experience, I have never played Magic Online. My experience of it is entirely watching people draft it, but I've done that many times, and I feel like I have a decent sense of the meta. But I'm still curious to hear what you think about these cards. So let's start with Library of Alexandria.
Ooh.
What's your take on Library of Alexandria, Anthony?
It's a card that, honestly, it doesn't look very assuming. It definitely obviously depends on the environment. If, like, very aggressive fast strategies are viable, it's going to get a lot worse. But when you play it the first time, it becomes really obvious really quickly why it is so high regarded.
Feels very cool.
It feels so
very cool. This is one that I still think is quite good. I think it's not. It's the only reason I don't include this card in my cube. I think it would be fine on power level. What I don't like about it is that it is so polarizing when it is good. Like
it is.
If you're in the control mirror or you're some mid-range deck playing against control, they basically can't beat the insane card advantage you get to generate from a turn one library. Meanwhile, if you're playing against aggro, it's kind of just a liability for the most part. Like it's just a colorless land, which is a very low cost of putting it in your deck. You still do it basically all the time, unless your mana base is really rough. But it doesn't do a whole lot for you. And so the fact that sort of card and how good it would be is kind of just a coin flip of what your opponent is playing, and how devastating it is when you are in that sort of mid-range control matchup or whatever is the reason I have avoided it in my own cube.
Right.
But I'll cite LSV's card evaluation here. LSV used to be quite high on Library. You can find articles of his from a few years ago where he cites it among like the best non-power cards in the Cube. And in the last couple seasons of Cube, he's basically completely off it and now believes it to be entirely unplayable. And you will find many people in the Cube community that either believe it is stone unplayable, just total trash. You can't take a turn off to draw a card that's not good enough in modern day Magic. And you'll find people that still think that it's a total unbeatable blowout. So it's really interesting to me how much people's opinions can completely diverge on cards and be that drastically different.
I mean, for my taste, it's not something I would probably consider in any environment, specifically because it is so high variance. If you draw at turn 1 and you're in a matchup where you can take a little bit of a tempo loss to get it going, it's absurd. But oftentimes it just doesn't really do that much. So I think it takes up more space in the game, in the actual Cube, in the draft environment than it really gives much benefit.
Yeah, not my kind of card, though I do think it's very good in those matchups.
And I will play it if I have the opportunity.
Next card, Anthony, what do you think of land tax?
Oof.
Famous constructed, troublemaker. This card was the center of a lot of constructed decks back in the day, because if you put 4 of it in your deck and you can mulligan aggressively to get one, you can build around it pretty dedicatedly. But how does it fare in Cube, do you think?
That's also interesting. It's kind of a similar one where it's like if you draw that hand that's playing 6 cards that do stuff in land tax. Sorry, not 6 cards.
No, that makes sense. I guess it'd be 5 cards, yeah, because you need planes in the land
cards.
tax.
Land tax does stuff. We'll count it in the does stuff cards.
Sure.
That just feels incredible. But you draw it late and it's like, okay, I can draw a bunch of lands. I'm not that into it. So I think I do actually have it in my cycling cube, specifically because it's actually like a synergy card. Like you can do something with those extra cards. It's not just have a bunch of lands. But in most contexts, I'm not that excited about playing it.
I have this one in my cube for a long time because I mean, truthfully, I really love the art and I think the card is cool. And there is still a part of me that wants to have a small aspect of like the quote unquote Museum of Magic in my cube. Like the fact that it was such a pronounced card and constructed and it was so relevant to the game, it makes me want to include it in my cube because it's like an iconic, cool card. To be clear, I like the new art, not the old horrible art. I want to make sure.
Thank you.
Want to make sure we're understanding that I'm of reasonable taste. But it was in there for a long time, and I played it a fair number of times. Sometimes it triggers. You get to get a bunch of lands in your hand. It does feel really strong in certain circumstances. Ultimately, I cut it for really just not doing enough. I just felt like it didn't do enough things, and it was really only certain circumstances where it actually shined. But people have recently been talking me back into putting it in my cube on the grounds that it is actually just totally busted. And I am open to being wrong about it and it actually being totally busted. And the sort of argument there is that, like you said, even in a game where you start on the play, for example, oftentimes it'll be reasonable either in early turns or middle turns of the game to like take a little tempo loss for a huge amount of card advantage. And it is... I mean, it's White Ancestral Recall. It's what they call it. Like, you get 3 cards for 1 if you get to trigger it once, which is a huge swing. Also fixes your mana. And importantly, like, there's other things to do with discarded cards. Someone mentioned, getting a bunch of lands and discarding them to Seasoned Hallowblade to keep it alive a whole bunch, which is a very real thing. If you have any kind of looter, that can be really relevant. And actually, the deck thinning in the late game does make it not a totally dead card when you don't need those lands anymore, because... at the point of the game where you're on turn 7 and you take 3 lands out of your deck, that's a big percentage of your deck you've just thinned out, just making the rest of your draws better. So I actually think I'm going to put it back in the cube soon and try it again, because I do think that it's the kind of card that is maybe quietly very good, that, doesn't necessarily feel broken when you do it because you're like, I just got some lands, whatever, but is actually very quietly, having a kind of profound effect on your win percentage and card advantage. But I'm not sure where I land on that one. But some people are in the firm do-nothing camp. This card is only for constructed. It's like in the category of things like Delver of Secrets and Deathrite Shaman that just don't translate to limited. And some people feel that it is just below power or levels of broken, like basically Ancestral Recall. So,
wow. I mean, I'm definitely excited about it if specifically there are things to do with extra cards.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like, that's not too hard to imagine even in a deck that's not explicitly going out of its way to try and do something with those cards. I feel like there's a lot of things that end up coming up kind of naturally. So, all right, let's end on this one, Anthony. This is maybe the most controversial cube card in the cube discourse. What do you think of Oracle of Moldiah?
Oof. I have to be honest. I've been looking at a lot of silver bordered cards this week, and I am having like daydreams constantly of playing Split Screen and Oracle of Moldiah together. Is this what you're hoping for? Is this the feedback?
Chef's kiss emoji. Chef's kiss emoji. Split Screen is the uncard that is most appealing to me. I actually bought a foil one a long time ago, and it sits in a little box because someday I think I'm going to put it in my cube, but I just haven't done it yet.
I love it. All right, one of these days we have to talk about some uncards. I think it's interesting that all of these cards that you're bringing up they're just really difficult to pin down. Like, they give you a lot of value, but they don't immediately win the game. Obviously, like, the really important part about Oracle of Moldiah is not that it lets you play extra lands, it's that it's filtering all the lands off the top of your library, so you're drawing more real cards. And I think the argument against it is just that, you can't spend turn 4 in a like Legacy Cube environment playing a 2/2. Like, your opponent's not even going to kill it. It just doesn't matter.
Well, it matters if it's Oracle of Moldiah because of all the extra rules text. You're right, the body is irrelevant.
Right. So, I mean, if you're playing an environment where you're just playing a 2/2 and you're just going to get run over by aggro, the like sort of card advantage it generates isn't really that valuable. Or if you're playing in a deck where you could just play Questing Beast and win the game, that's the best source of card advantage. So yeah, unfortunately I don't have a hot take. I think it's an extremely powerful card. I think definitely you can have an environment where you can get a ton of extra value either out of the extra landfall triggers, from being able to clear and manipulate the top of your library. But I think in a lot of environments it definitely underperforms in today's Magic.
Yeah, I think this one is entirely environment dependent, and again, there are people that maintain that Oracle of Moldiah is like one of the best green cards, one of the only reasons to be in green in a vintage cube environment, up there with things like Channel and Natural Order. And there are people that maintain that it is downright unplayable and a liability. You should never put it in your deck. To the second category of people, one of the things they always knock it for is that it dies to so much removal, and I would argue that if it's a card that you must remove because of how good it is, then that's something that is worth consideration. Like, they're like, oh, they just kill it every time. It's like, well, if they have to kill it every time, then it must be doing something. It must be pretty okay for it to always warrant removal. I really think here, though, it just comes down to, like, what the overall thrust of the cube is. And my cube, I strive for an environment that is quote-unquote fair, which I recognize as a completely subjective descriptor. Fair, but at the most pushed level of fair possible. So everything just shy of whatever I deem to be unfair, right? So, like, Mind Twist is over that line for me. Like, Mind Twist I don't think is a very fair Magic card. Strategies like Storm, really overpowered ramp effects like, Grim Monolith. Like, that stuff to me all falls in the unfair category. But all my decks are trying to win in fair ways. There is no combo. There is no weird mill strategy or whatever. You're just going to kill your opponent eventually by attacking with creatures. That's how you're going to win the game. So in my environment, I do think it's a liability. I do have a lot of removal, and on turn 4, the green decks, I want to be proactive against the control decks and basically pressure them. And it doesn't really apply any pressure. Like, even drawing a couple cards against your deck is not a huge nightmare if you're a control deck. So, like, it just doesn't fill a role that needs to be filled in that environment. But I have been, because it's Vintage Cube season, I've been watching drafts of all my favorite streamers playing the Magic Online Vintage Cube. And one thing I think everyone likes to be the player that drafts Storm, right? Drafting Storm is just fun. It's fun to draft Storm, fun to play Storm. The reason that a lot of us don't include it in our cubes is that it's a nightmare to play against. It's like the least fun thing imaginable, because if the deck comes together, it's very powerful and, kind of can't be beat by normal strategies. And I think a common mistake I think a lot of cube designers make is trying to put Storm alongside, like, green-white mid-range. And it's like, if the Storm deck has a reasonable draw, there's nothing a green-white mid-range deck can do to beat the Storm deck if it's just playing mid-range threats. It's never going to happen. So I have been, in my, infinite spare time, I'm up late at night not sleeping, puttering around with a cube list that is unpowered but also unfair, with the goal of supporting Storm and supporting other strategies that interact with and are in sort of the same stratosphere as Storm. And in that environment, I do think Oracle of Moldiah becomes playable and quite good, specifically because I have lots of wheel effects. And I think that the playing 2 lands a turn goes up quite a bit when you have lots of wheels and you're not going to run out of lands to play. Also include things like Fast Bond in that cube, which is, rude and not very nice. And because Fast Bond and Oracle is in there, you can start to justify kind of narrow combos like Crucible and Strip Mine, right? Which Crucible Strip Mine I consider unfair. Don't have it in my normal cube. But that's the kind of thing that your quote-unquote like mid-rangey deck would have to do against Storm in order to compete, right? So I do entirely think it's a matter of environment. And specifically in the Magic Online cube, I think it actually is quite good. A lot of players would disagree, but there isn't as much removal there. Aggro is not the most supported in that environment. And very oftentimes the games come down to like who gets to do the most broken thing. And Oracle has a really high ceiling. It can be a very broken when it is good. And I think that high ceiling is worth pursuing in that particular cube environment. Anything else to say on any of those subjects?
I had one other small question for you. Maybe
Hit me.
a little question to leave you on. Maybe we can think about it over the week.
I'm ready.
I think we're both pretty much on team hate drafting in cube team draft, specifically like your Legacy cube team draft. Doesn't really make that much sense. Do you think it would be interesting, and what are like the obvious archetypes or obvious strategies you would take to try and make a cube specifically designed for team draft that would promote hate drafting?
That's a very interesting question, Anthony. I feel like the team draft is so well suited to like normal limited almost that my goal would be to have a very similar power band to normal limited and just maybe like shave off a little bit of the bottom so you don't have like the pure unplayable stuff, right? And just have like everything from like C minuses, D pluses to A pluses, right? And just get rid of those Fs and Ds and whatnot, because those are really not the cards you want in your deck. And I feel like with that kind of power band, then you could actually look at a pack and say, out of this pack, I expect that these cards are going to be picked next, and I think it's any reasonable player would kind of agree with me. I also wonder if you were to do that, if it would start to make sense to somehow collate packs strategically with like a specific number of rares / mythic rares or whatever you deemed the most powerful suite of cards, to actually seed them to make sure that there wasn't a pack that just had 6 mythics in it and then you couldn't take anything as a signal. Because I do think that aspect specifically is extra important in team draft, because you get to look at a pack and say, well, there's an uncommon missing and this rare is still in the pack, and so that uncommon, the only uncommon better than this rare by my reckoning is this particular removal spell, and so I'm assuming that's what my player took before me, and that's obviously not something you can do in a normal cube ever.
Right. And I think the other issue is that, I'll keep using Glorybringer as the example. If
Card's
you're
pretty good
playing,
and limited, I hear.
If you're playing team draft with, sealed booster packs, that's going to come up sometimes, but you're going to have a different mix of rares every draft. Whereas if you build a cube where you're having, a specific set of cards, if that card's going to appear every single time and you're going to play against it at least one time if it hasn't been hated every draft, that could become pretty repetitive. So yeah, you might
can't
be
just
right
have a bigger cube. Lots of
Right.
people prefer bigger than 360 cubes for that exact reason. And at a 6-person draft, and a 360 cube is already too big, so you're already going to have some variation there in terms of what's opened. I gave this some thought with regards to the sealed cube we talked about before, and I felt like I was thinking about this a little more, and I feel like the most fun version of the sealed cube would have cards divided by quote-unquote rarity. It would have like, here are the powerful cards that are meant to be the like bombs that pull you into a specific color, and just give everybody 6 to 8 of those in every sealed pool, and like that can come from a much bigger pool, so that like those build arounds there's more variation in them from sealed pool to sealed pool. And then the normal cards, the bread and butter filler stuff, is just still randomized, but from a different set of cards that doesn't have those outliers. I thought that could be a fun way to build that particular sealed environment when I was mulling over it more. Maybe we could do a similar thing with team draft.
If you're willing to collate packs, I will play. I don't know if that's something that a length I'm willing to go to.
I'm always down to try and experiment, Anthony. We should draft your cube again soon. You've been drafting these other cubes you've been working on, your mono black cube, your cycling cube. Let's get a draft in soon. Play them for next week or something.
Yeah, I'd be excited to. I pulled out a big stack of cards, honestly maybe 20% of the cube, that I'm ready to cut. So I need to make some hard decisions.
Go through and make those changes, and I will review them maybe, and we'll talk about them next week. I'm sure we can get a lot of fruitful discussion out of that.
Absolutely. That'd be great.
All right, buddy. Thanks for chatting. If you're out there listening, you can find more from us at luckypaper.co. That's our website. You can sign up for our newsletter, see other podcast episodes, read some articles, make sure you don't miss a survey. By the time this episode comes out, we will very shortly be publishing the M21 and Jumpstart Perspective articles, which Jet has been working feverishly on. So look forward to those. And have fun playing Magic out there, friends.